Hi, and thanks for joining us for our discussion today on how you can grow your digital ag strategy for your farming operation. I'm Jim Mintert, Director of the Purdue Center for Commercial Agriculture, and joining me today are my colleagues, Dr. Nathan DeLay and Dr. Nathan Thompson, both of whom are assistant professors in the Department of Agricultural Economics here at Purdue, and also partners in the Center for Commercial Agriculture. So we've done some research, Nate, talking about looking at several different things with respect to how people can improve and maybe capture the benefits of digital agriculture today. And I'm going to let us talk a little bit about what we've done. We've done a couple of research projects. One was a survey that we did here at Purdue of corn and soybean farmers around the nation. And the other is based on some data that USDA has been collecting over the years, pretty detailed information with respect to surveys that they've been doing on an enterprise level. And we've done some significant analysis of that data to try and learn how people are capturing the benefits of digital agriculture. So with that, let's kind of start with some of that USDA data and look at the adoption rates for digital agriculture and various technologies.
Yeah, thanks, Jim. So this is a nationally representative sample of farms, and these are corn farms, and USDA does pretty in-depth farm level and field level surveys roughly every 5 years for a different commodity. So we've been looking at corn farms, and if you look at trends in adoption rates of precision agriculture technologies, what you see is between the early 2000s and about 2010, there were pretty significant increases in adoption rates across most precision ag technologies. But you see in terms of percentage of farms, that's kind of plateaued in the last 5-6 years, or from 2010 to 2016. So if you were to look back previous to 2005, you would see, again, pretty sharp increases. And what this is kind of telling us is that there's some level of saturation happening in terms of the percentage of farms that are adopting these technologies. If we were to look at the percentage of acreage that these technologies are used on, you would probably see a different story where that number is higher in all years and probably increasing at a significantly higher rate since 2010.
And Nathan, you've looked at that with the Purdue survey.
Yeah, so I think that what I see here, at first glance, sometimes it can be a little surprising, especially that leveling off here in the last, from 2010 to 2015. Obviously, we've had about 5 years since then. But when you compare that to what we see in the Purdue survey, where we're focusing more on what we call commercial scale farms, so that would be farms 1,000 acres or more, that as Nate mentioned, right, we have this saturation. And so, the adoption rates for some of these technologies that are a little more common, so yield monitors, guidance, things of that nature, are well above 80%, 90%. And so, of those farms that are kind of commercial scale, where we would expect to see adoption, we see that a lot of these technologies, at least the ones that have been around a little bit longer, are pretty widely adopted.
Yeah, so really a pretty big difference when you start looking at the commercial scale 1,000 acres up versus the smaller farms that are included in the Purdue survey. So you've done some work, Nate, quite a bit of work actually, in terms of statistically trying to sort into groups how people are using technology. And let's talk a little bit about that. That's based on the USDA data, so this is national data representative of the entire corn industry, so to speak, right?
Correct. And so what we've done is we've taken these, there's a battery of questions on, it's called the ARM survey, which is this very detailed USDA survey. And we've looked at specifically the 2016 corn survey, and we've tried to group farms in terms of the way that they bundle and adopt different precision ag technologies. So we do something called cluster analysis, which is just a statistical tool that allows us to group farms. And the first group that we identified is notable because they don't use any of these technologies. They don't use a yield monitor, they're not using GPS guidance, they're not engaging with any of these tools. So we call this group NonAdopters, and they're typically smaller farms, on average 278 corn acres in operation. The average age of the operator on these operations is close to 60, and 41% have a college degree. So it's a significant group because, again, there's no adoption happening with this group.
And the next group has adopted some technology.
Yep. Yeah, you can think of these as passive adopters because they've got the sort of entry-level product, the yield monitor. So 68% of these farms are using a yield monitor, but they're not engaging with the yield monitor in a way that would lead to improved decision making. So they're not generating maps from their yield monitor data. They're not very many of them are using guidance, very few variable rate technologies, things like this. So we consider these passive adopters because they have the technology, but they're not really using it.
Yeah, so I like to think of these folks, because again, yield monitor shows up there as kind of, a good indicator of what this group, a lot of them have a yield monitor. But really passive adopters are anybody who maybe buys a new piece of equipment that comes with some sort of technology, and that's kind of where it stops, right? They didn't really actively go out and adopt a yield monitor. It probably came on their the new purchase of a combine, and then it kind of stops there. There's no kind of active analysis of the data that they collect using that, right?
Correct. Yeah.
And this is sort of like the entry level of what you'd call commercial scale operations, because at least here in the Corn Belt, if you think about 550 acres of corn, that might mean they might be operating in the ballpark of 1,000 acres or 1,100 acres, something like that, if they're doing a 50-50 corn and soybean split. So that's kind of at the beginning level of what we typically would think about as commercial scale, and certainly what we called commercial scale in our other survey. Mm-hmm. So then the third group was one we called data users, and what are the characteristics of the data users?
Well, in the way that passive adopters were characterized by their lack of engaging with their yield monitor data, data users are using that yield monitor to produce GPS yield maps. So 90% of the farms in that group are making yield maps. They're also using GPS guidance at pretty high rates. So there's this mix of the equipment-based precision ag tools like yield monitors and GPS guidance with some digital tools in the form of yield maps. We're also seeing that they use computers to analyze their data at fairly high rates. And we do see a pretty big increase in the number of acres when you go from passive adopters to data users, as well as a significant decrease in the average age of the operator. So in terms of averages, 58 versus 54 is a pretty significant difference in operator age, and a much bigger increase in the proportion of those that have a college degree.
Those first two categories had average ages that were actually pretty close to the average age of all farm operations across the U.S. Now we're starting to see a change here with the people moving into that data users category. And then the last category is the one that we call information seekers.
Right, so data users is sort of the first level of being really advanced, and we wanted to distinguish this fourth group because they're taking data and they're making it into information. So these are really data-driven operations. Almost all of them have a yield monitor. Virtually all of them are producing maps, either in the form of yield maps or soil sample maps. Guidance, very high rates, and a lot of them are doing variable rate technology. So they're doing variable rate nutrient management or seeding or even pesticide treatments. So this is a group that's characterized by their high level of engagement with the data that their equipment generates.
So I'll jump in here and say, the other one that sticks out to me that you didn't maybe mention was the sharing of data with service providers. Yep. And we'll talk about some more details about some different things that we've done around data sharing as we go forward. But I think one of the things, Jim, we've seen is there is no one-size-fits-all strategy as it relates to data. We've seen farms that have done this in different ways, and one of the ways that we can do that is sharing data, right? Leveraging others' ability to harness that data into information. And so, I think that one really sticks out there in terms of the information seekers. A willingness to share, that can be one strategy forward if we don't feel like we have the resources we need on the farm.
Yeah, in recent years, we've had opportunities to work pretty closely with some farms that are using different strategies to actually be in that information seeker category. Right. Some of them doing it internally, some of them doing it with very heavy reliance on outside service providers. So let's look at the percentages here by both operations and corn acreage. And so we're going to look at the different categories in two different ways, and it's going to tell a different story.
Exactly. So we have a good sense of who these farms are. Now if we look at the proportion of farms that each group makes up, you see that it's pretty heavily skewed towards non-adopters and passive adopters. So despite a lot of the sort of enthusiasm around digital agriculture and ag tech, according to the survey work that we've done, over 2/3 of farms are in either of these categories where they have a pretty modest amount of adoption, and even over 1/3 in that non-adopters category where they don't have any levels of adoption. So looking at information seekers, only 13% of farms make up that group, but when we look at percentage of corn acres, we're going to see, like you said, a much different story.
Yeah, so the acreage does look a lot different.
Yeah. So if you look at data users and information seekers as a group, and you think of these as sort of your more advanced farms, it's about half of corn acreage under operation, despite the fact that the proportion of farms is much lower. So this has some implications about the advantages to these technologies at different scales and the types of farms that are adopting these, and going forward, what farm consolidation might have, what the implications might be for ag tech.
Yeah, at first glance, one of the inferences of that slide is to think about the idea that data users and information seekers are probably growing more rapidly in terms of the size of their operation over time than people in the other two categories, right?
Correct.
So we've also taken a look at farm data software usage, and this is based on information from the Purdue survey, Nate.
Yeah, so in the Purdue survey that we did, we tried to dig a little bit deeper into some of these things, and so we were really interested in this idea of farm data software. There's a plethora of products available on the market that farmers are having to choose from. And so we were really interested in understanding a little bit better kind of, why they choose what they choose and what different software products they might be using. And so here we're just looking at kind of the use of farm software by farm size, right? So we have 3 farm size categories: 1,000 to 2,000, 2,000 to 5,000, and greater than 5,000. And you can see, as we would probably expect, that software use increases with that farm size. So in that smallest category here that we looked at in this survey, 1,000 to 2,000 acres, about 36% of those farms were using some sort of farm data software. You jump to that biggest category, right? Farms greater than 5,000 acres, 63% of those were using some sort of farm software on the farm. And so, using those softwares to leverage the data that they're collecting, turn that into information. There certainly seems to be some use of software among farmers to kind of use that to create that information. I think Nate wants to talk a little bit about the next slide. We dug a little bit deeper into the different types of softwares, and it's really interesting to look at that distribution and what people are using. So
take a look at that, Nate.
That's right. So we asked this sample, again, commercial scale farms, the specific products that they're using on their farm. And we came up with this list that doesn't cover everything, but we felt like was a pretty good representation of the major products on the market. What's interesting is that, and before I go on, I want to be clear that this is of the farms that are using software. This is the proportion that use different products. So 44% of our sample use some kind of farm software, and then of that 44%, 52% are using Climate Field View, 44% using John Deere Operations Center, and so on. And what you see is this other category, which is any other product that we didn't list, made up almost a fourth of software users. So what this tells us is this market is far from saturated. There's a real long tail in the products that are coming out and that are available to farmers. And if we were to be more comprehensive, we could have created a pretty long list. What is also notable is if you look at the number of products farmers are using, the average was about 2. So the story there is there's no one-stop shop for these software services that are doing everything. And in fact, it's pretty clear that farms are integrating different technologies that specialize in different things. And the question is, going forward, how does the market integrate different products, or do they want to stay separate, do unique things, and then something like an integration platform that brings everything together? We really don't know how that's going to shake out.
Although we don't know exactly how it's going to shake out, but it seems likely that over time we're going to see some level of firms doing a better job of taking data from various sources and allowing it to reside in one place, right? I mean, I think that's probably where we're headed. But it hasn't been sorted out yet, and it's not clear who's going to be the market leader, right?
Exactly.
Okay. So we went a little farther than that, and we asked people about sharing data with outside service providers, and this is a little bit controversial, right? The whole idea of sharing data has been a big issue in agriculture for a number of years.
Yeah, so definitely gets a lot of attention, which is kind of what led us to want to gather a little more information about how farmers actually feel about it, and more importantly, kind of what they're actually doing, right? So software is kind of one way to take the data, harness it, evaluate it, and make some sort of recommendation potentially. An alternative to that would be to share the data with someone else and allow them to do that if we don't feel like we have the ability in-house to do that. And so we kind of came up with some pretty standard categories here and asked on the survey, do you share your farm data with any of these groups? And so, not surprisingly, the two largest groups there are agronomists. You share your data with your agronomist or your ag input supplier, so 58%, 44% respectively. To be honest, I was a little surprised. Those numbers are relatively high. Given all of the negative attention that sharing data gets kind of in the ag media, potential for privacy concerns and things of that nature. Obviously, your agronomist or your ag input supplier is probably a trusted service provider, and so that relationship probably has a lot to do with that. But still, those numbers are relatively high, right? To say that farmers are not willing to share their data would be an overstatement, in my opinion, based on these results. That farmers are willing to share, and we'll talk a little bit later about the benefits they get from that. The other thing that we have here is, there is about a quarter of the sample that say, no, I don't share data with anybody. And so, not to say that those people don't exist. They represent a quarter of our sample here, but they're not necessarily the majority, right?
And I think we'll share more about this in a minute, but we think people that aren't sharing data probably are losing something in terms of not leveraging the information, the data, and turning it into information as well as they could, perhaps.
I agree, yeah.
So. All right, let's take a little closer look at the impact of software use and what that does with respect to data sharing and decision making. And so the first one we looked at was seeding rate decisions.
Yeah, so just a little bit of background. So part of what our interest was in doing the survey that we did here at Purdue was this idea of a data life cycle. And so a lot of the attention in precision ag gets placed on adoption of hardware or the collection of data. But I work with a lot of farms that talk about they have a bowl full of thumb drives sitting on the office desk, and that information just never really goes any further than that. So our question was kind of moving or proceeding along that data life cycle of, we don't just collect data, but then do we turn that data into an actionable decision? And then we'll talk about here in a second, what are the outcomes associated with those data-informed decisions in terms of yield or profitability or efficiency. So starting out, again, we're looking at here how the use of software and or the willingness to share data influenced how my data influences my seeding rate decision. So I'm actually going to use data to influence my seeding rate decision. So if I did not use software and I did not share with an outside service provider, about 9% of those folks said that their data actually influenced their seeding rate decisions. And we can see if we we look at the farmers who are willing to actually share data with a service provider, still didn't use the software, we see a pretty big jump in the how that data influences seeding rate decisions, so from 9% to 29%. We can look at it an alternative way. So if we look at folks who use the software, so maybe we're doing some more internal analysis of that data on the farm, but did not share externally, we still get a pretty big jump in how that data influences seeding rate decisions. So again, from 9% to 23%. And then what I think is even more interesting is we get this additive effect. So if you use a software product and you share that data with an outside service provider, that use of that data to inform seeding rate decisions jumps to 41% of producers. And so, we definitely see individual benefits of software use, potentially representing kind of internal data analysis on the farm, as well as the ability of an external service provider to leverage that data into a data-informed decision. And so, that's for seeding rate specifically. So we also did kind of a similar thing looking at fertilizer decisions. And again, we get a very similar story. Overall use is of the data to inform fertilizer decisions a little bit higher. That doesn't surprise me. Those sorts of decisions have been around a little bit longer in terms of using data to inform fertilizer decisions. But the trend, the use of software, bumps the ability of data to inform fertilizer decision. The same with data sharing, and then we get the same sort of additive effect that if we use both, we're even more willing to be able to leverage that data into information.
So that aspect of it was looking at are you using data coming out of software or not coming out of software, sharing with service providers to inform decision making. Right. Nate, you went one step further and said, okay, what's it doing to yield, right? What's it doing to output, right? So same kind of idea. What's the impact been on yield?
Right, so the follow-up question was, given that you've made this decision based on your data, how do you perceive the effects of that decision? Did it increase your yields, decrease your yields, or have no impact? So looking at the percentage that said it improved their yields, again, we see that if you don't use software, but you go that one step further of sharing data with somebody outside the farm, an increase from 48% to 75% regarding that decision as being yield improving. And then when we go vertically, the same story where adding a software product to the mix improves your perception of the yield impact. But the additive effect is now smaller relative to the decision-making aspect. So I think that's an important distinction. If you just do one or the other, that's really doing the lion's share of the work in terms of your perceptions of the data on your yields. If we look at fertilizer decisions, the same story emerges where we're seeing increases in the positive perception of your data-informed decision-making, and again, the additive effect a little bit more modest.
So in both cases, though, it looks like bundling pays, right? The idea of using software and then sharing that data with an outside service provider, maybe to get some help with interpretation of that, gave us a little bit of a bump, both in terms of using it to make decisions and a little bit of a bump with respect to what we think it did with respect to yields.
Yeah, one of the ways that we've described that, I think Nate coined this term, at least for me, was kind of touch points, right? The more touch points that we had on our data, the more likely we were to use it, and the more likely we were to see these benefits, right? And so I don't know if you have anything to add to that, but I think that's a really good way to think about it is, again, we've seen different farms do things different ways, but more touch points is certainly beneficial for just leveraging and harnessing the value that's there, because maybe there's something we can do internally using a software product. Maybe there's a gap where we need, our agronomist or input supplier to come in and fill that. So the more hands, the more eyes we can get on that data, I think the more value we're starting to add to the farm.
Right, and to tie it back to the USDA data that we've looked at, I think that bottom right-hand corner that is using software and sharing is pretty reflective of the information seekers group. And so what we're going to see on the next slide is the actual efficiency benefits associated with being in one of these advanced groups.
So let's take a look at that. So we took, again, using some pretty sophisticated econometric techniques, you looked at that data set pretty intensively and tried to figure out what is the impact on output, because that's really where we wanted to go with this, not just is it influencing decision making and what do we think, what impact is it really having on our efficiency?
Exactly. So this is a graph the green line is showing you the maximum efficient production that a farm could achieve for some mix of inputs. So if you think about, however much nitrogen, pesticides, labor capital that you're using on the farm, there's some maximum feasible production that you'd like to hit in terms of bushels per acre. So we wanted to map those four groups that we identified in the cluster analysis in terms of their ability to achieve that maximum production level. And so that's what we did. And thinking about the green line as your 100% efficiency level, what we're going to see is that farms in the advanced stages of precision ag adoption are closer to that 100% efficient production level than our farms in the non-adopters group. And the difference is the largest between what we called the passive adopters and the data users group, where efficiency goes from 80% to 85%. There's a small bump that we see between data users and information seekers, but it's not huge and it's not statistically significant. So the story here is, in terms of efficiency, the greatest bang for your buck is going from a passive data strategy to an active data strategy.
And that's really interesting. If you think about it, those are pretty big differences, because particularly if you compare it to, say, the non-adopters versus the data users, moving from 77% to 85% efficient, that's a lot.
Right. And it's very meaningful when you multiply that at scale.
Yeah. And so if you think about who's going to be successful from a long-term perspective, it's pretty clear looking at our data and the analysis that the two of you have done. You want to be in that upper category, right? You want to be a data user. If you're really going to be a long-run player in this industry, that's clearly a benefit that you can't afford to give up from a long-term perspective. Short run, you can do lots of things, but longer run, if you really want to be successful, you need to capture those benefits. Well, let's kind of think about some takeaways here. So that's kind of wraps up our review of the analysis we've done. It's pretty obvious, and that previous slide really illustrated it. If you're a passive adopter of precision ag tech, you're losing ground compared to at least some of your neighbors, right? There's a significant portion of the industry that's still in that category, But as you look ahead, if you really plan to be a player in this industry longer term, you need to move out of that category, right?
Yeah, I agree. And I kind of mentioned this earlier. I think that, again, I characterize these passive adopters as, some sort of piece of hardware came with a new equipment purchase, and that's where it stopped. And I think that if that's you, you need to be really careful about what the goals of the farm are moving forward, because if you stop there, you're like you mentioned, you're losing ground compared to your competitors, because they're taking that, they're collecting the data, harnessing that to generate value on their farm. And so it doesn't mean you have to do it yourself, right? Again, we've talked about various kind of avenues moving forward of how you could make that jump from a passive adopter to a data user or even an information seeker. But I think, to me, that's kind of, as you're thinking in your mind, am I that person that, I have the technology, but I have the data sitting, in a jump drive on my in a bowl on my desk. You're the type of person that the opportunity is there. You haven't been left behind by any means. I think you would agree with that, right? And so it's really taking that jump to start thinking, how can I actually use the data?
Yeah. And I think related to that, and this ties into it, farms that bundle technologies are significantly more efficient than those that don't, right? And we saw that in the data. So you could be at that first stage and you're starting to get ready to do some things, but if you really want to capture and leverage the impact of the data you've been collecting, you've got a bundle.
Exactly. And one thing to point out here is that those efficiency benefits that we've identified are robust to controlling for things like operator experience level, farm size, different farm structures. So even when you control for those factors that you would otherwise associate with efficiency, we still see benefits coming through from bundling precision ag technologies.
So, what's the cost of standing still? What do you think?
So again, just looking at what's happening in ag tech, just the growth and the consolidation and kind of what we see in terms of some of these efficiency gains, there's certainly going to be a cost to standing still. This is moving forward whether we like it or not. We've seen that across various analyses as far as, the farm data lifecycle. Folks are just moving more and more forward. And so, what we see is these information seekers are the ones that are just kind of one step ahead. And if you're looking to be moving forward, if you want to kind of be on the cutting edge, then there are certainly going to be opportunities to finding out, what is the, we talked about consolidation and software. What is the software that's going to be the one that kind of leverages the most value for my farm? What, is it drones? All of these things that are out there that maybe haven't been fully harnessed. The information seekers are the ones that are kind of going out there and pushing the envelope as far as how we can turn that into value on the farm. Does that mean that you have to be kind of on the bleeding edge? I don't know. I think that our analysis shows that you could be a fast follower, right? And you could probably generate some value from these strategies, but there's definitely going to be a cost to standing still and not doing anything.
So one way to think about that, and you're right, in our analysis, the difference between the information seekers and the data users was not statistically significant. But if you're not in that information seeker category, as soon as they demonstrate that there's value to that technology, you want to be that person that adopts it pretty quickly, right? Because that's, over time, that clearly is going to be the direction we move as an industry. So looking ahead, what should you do?
Well, I think the bullet point sums it up perfectly. No one technology is going to provide all of the benefits that we see come through from a bundling or a systems approach. So it's sort of attractive to think that, be it drones or be it a specific software platform, is the thing that's going to drive the efficiency of your operation. What we're seeing is it's really a integration of multiple different products and, again, touch points. If you can engage with your data that your equipment's generating in more ways, in more innovative ways, that's when you're going to see the benefits.
Obviously, it's important to keep pace with your competitors, but to me, the key to success is to develop a strategy that fits you and your farm. And you and I were talking about this earlier. You think back to almost introductory farm management, which is a class that you teach these days. One of the things you talk about is identifying your resource base and figuring out what it is you have in terms of skill sets on that farm. And we've worked with a number of different farms that have different skill sets, and they've come up with different strategies. You might elaborate on that a little bit.
Yeah, I think that's really, I don't think we could sum it up any better than kind of, what fits for you and your farm. And we've showed some different things throughout the presentation today, and just to kind of maybe pull some of that together, right? We've worked with some farms where they felt as though maybe the internal human capital, the internal resources that they had wasn't getting the most out of their farm data, and they were very, very successful outsourcing that to a service provider, right? Whether that's an agronomist or input supplier, whatever the case.
In some cases, more than one service provider.
That's right. And so even bundling those together. And so they were able to be very successful from a digital agriculture standpoint, using precision agriculture, leveraging the value of data, using an outside service provider. Alternatively, right, we have worked with farms that wanted everything in-house, had the skill set in-house to do that. We're using a ton of different software products, layering data, generating their own recommendations, just as successful, right? And so really evaluating kind of what fits best on your farm. Do you have the internal resources in terms of maybe a younger generation coming back with a skill set that allows you to do some data analysis? If that's not the case, or maybe you're just not interested, it certainly is not anything wrong with outsourcing that sort of analysis to a third party that has expertise in that area, right? So maybe your expertise is not in data analysis, your expertise is in agronomy, you're a great agronomist. Leveraging outside help to make the most of that data is certainly still can provide a lot of value. That's what our results show.
You've got to generate the touch points, right? Whether you do it in-house or with somebody outside the farm.
Yep, we saw the cumulative effect of engaging both with software and with service providers has meaningful benefits. Being in that more of the advanced stages of those farm groups, regardless of your farm size, we're seeing efficiency gains. So yeah, it's all about engaging with your data and your digital ag systems as much as you can.
All right. Well, thanks for joining us. That kind of wraps up our discussion of how to grow your digital ag strategy successfully for your farming operation. If you haven't tapped into our website, purdue.edu/commercial ag, we've got lots of information out there, monthly newsletter, we do podcasts, we've got lots of videos like this one, we do Outlook, the crop basis tool, which Nate developed here a while back, so lots of information that you could tap into, and we'd encourage you to tap into that and maybe get on our monthly newsletter list. So with that, on behalf of my colleagues and the Purdue Center for Commercial Agriculture, I'm Jim Mintert. Thanks for joining us.